Chapter 6 really begins the process of moving away from some of these larger topics, the many broad topics we've covered, including the government, the healthcare systems, policymaking, and law. And now we start getting into more of the essentials that you all will need for your specific fields, including individual healthcare rights, health insurance, government insurance, and health reform, health economics, healthcare quality, and then public health preparedness. So by the time we get into the sixth or seventh week of the course, answering a question like, why does the US not have universal healthcare coverage, will be an easier question to answer for you than it was before you started the course. So in chapter 6, we will focus specifically on the rights of the individual and how this differs from other countries, any limitations of individual rights associated with healthcare, and then balancing individual rights versus overall public health. Again, the balancing act that I've mentioned several times in the course, it continues in this chapter. So chapter 6, and we need to make this clear, chapter 6 only deals with situations where individuals have access to healthcare. So the right to healthcare in this case is talking about once individuals have access to it. It's not a right to access. It's the rights individuals have after access. So we need to make that distinction. This includes refusing any unwanted treatments, the personal right to autonomy, and the freedom from wrongful discrimination. So technological advancements and increasing global threats are making these issues really difficult to navigate. In the book, they go through a scenario in box 6-1. And once you read that, I want you to consider if the doctor has the right to refuse treatment, or should he or she be held legally responsible in situations for ethical reasons. The court decision in this case that they go over is that in obtaining the state's license or permission to practice medicine, the state does not require and the license does not engage that he, in this case, will practice at all or on other terms that he may choose to accept. Meaning, this gets into the top bullet point you see on the slide, which is the no duty to treat principle. Okay? A license does not provide an obligation to practice, just like a driver's license doesn't include the obligation to drive. Just having a license as a doctor does not mean you have to practice on the spot when anybody else wants you to. Okay? If you choose to practice, you're qualified to have a license. Okay? In terms of a right to health care, that is unchanged by the Affordable Care Act. We are closer to a right to care, but it's strictly a health insurance related bill. Okay? One of the key back and forth issues that we're going to run into in this particular chapter is the no duty to treat principle versus EMTALA. EMTALA provides a legal access to hospital care and medical emergencies regardless of the ability to pay. So individuals participating in specific health plans may be obligated to extend care to all plan members. Overall, there's no federal constitutional right to welfare, such as food, housing, education, and healthcare. But as more time passes, more laws and regulations continue to chip away at this concept. States have created their own plan to cover all citizens, like Maine's Dorigo Health Reform Act. And states have enacted laws that guarantee a right to education. So this guaranteed right to access to care, yes, it's not there, but it's being chipped away at by states and by other laws. In the United States, in general, healthcare is still considered a commodity. So it's like bread, it's like vacuum cleaners, it's like a TV. And so this is a difference of opinion from the United States to other countries. Okay? In many other countries, healthcare, most other countries, healthcare is considered a legal right. In the United States, it is not. And so this issue in many cases comes down to different political, cultural, and governmental viewpoints. Okay? So the US is the world leader in medical technology and the quantity of medical services. And other countries, as I mentioned, tend to look at healthcare as a social good. They specifically choose to offer this service even though it could be supported privately. Many defend offering universal healthcare coverage because it's viewed as an international human rights principle. Specifically, in the book, it's mentioned that many other countries view healthcare as addressing the dignity and worth of human beings. The standards of living for health and well-being must be met through healthcare. The World Health Organization has made a very clear stance on this issue. The enjoyment, and this is a quote from them, the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic, or social condition. So the World Health Organization clearly states that they believe healthcare is a human right, and every country should offer that. So simply stating this information in a constitution does not necessarily guarantee this right will be recognized or enforced. So the US has historically been averse to accepting international human rights standards and conforming national laws to meet them. So the United States is somewhat against just going with the flow of every other country. With that said, the US did consider a universal healthcare system in the 1940s and 50s. That is actually what led to Medicare and Medicaid being implemented in the 1960s, but no universal health plan was ever put into place in the US. Okay? When we go through and more specifically examine individual rights in the healthcare system, we have to consider EMTALA once again. So EMTALA, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act are all examples of what we're talking about, okay? With what we're going through with number one, receiving services explicitly provided under healthcare, health financing, or other health insurance laws. EMTALA is a law, Medicaid is a law, the Affordable Care Act is a law, okay? So number two, freedom of choice and freedom from government interference when making healthcare decisions, okay? Choosing to have an abortion potentially could be an example of number two. And number three, people are free from unlawful discrimination when accessing or receiving healthcare. This is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which you see a picture of being signed in the picture. EMTALA is the only true universal right to healthcare in the United States. Why was EMTALA passed in the 1980s? It prevented what was referred to as patient dumping, where people were turned away because they were poor or uninsured. This was very common practice in private hospitals, and those individuals ended up in the public hospitals, which became flooded with individuals, okay? So we had the no duty to treat principle. This was countered with EMTALA, and these two things go back and forth. Do people have a legal right to healthcare according to no duty to treat? They don't. According to EMTALA, in some ways they do. Okay, and so this is a back and forth that's difficult to navigate. The duties of EMTALA include an appropriate screening for those seeking emergency care and a stabilization of any condition that's deemed an emergency. So if a person goes into any emergency room, they cannot be turned away. So a lot of what we saw in some of the stories with COVID-19 was people being turned away for their symptoms. That's illegal. You cannot do that. If they are coming in with any kind of emergent situation, they have to be stabilized before they can be sent away. Okay, so you cannot deny care at the emergency room level. If you do, there are heavy financial penalties for violating EMTALA. Medicaid confers the right to individually enforce their program obligations through the courts, unlike any other healthcare financing law. And this is a hotly debated topic where legal entitlements to benefits are viewed as a key contributor to some of the high costs of that program. Okay. Lastly, the Affordable Care Act attempts to transform healthcare from a commodity to a social good that's accessible to all citizens. The goal of the Affordable Care Act when it was initially drafted was universal healthcare coverage. Actually, by this point in time, by 2019, the goal was to have everybody covered universally because of the Affordable Care Act. Clearly, that did not happen. Okay, so the Affordable Care Act attempted to ban any kind of exclusion or discrimination based on health status or pre-existing condition. And it also protected individuals from any kind of lifetime expenditure caps, okay? Once a person has insurance, according to the Affordable Care Act, that cannot be taken away or rescinded anymore. The Affordable Care Act also provided financial subsidies to low and moderate income individuals and small businesses to try and increase access to healthcare. It created state health insurance exchanges through which individuals and small businesses could purchase healthcare. And when we get into the Affordable Care Act a little bit more, we'll talk about Medicaid expansion to try and cover the non-elderly, to cover low-income individuals, and to try to close the gap for those who are uninsured and don't have access to health care. Okay? So we have a balancing approach that's developed. So the last 15 years has really brought this to light. And where do we draw the line between individual autonomy and government authority in the name of public welfare and national security? Okay? And this again is where police powers have come into place for licensing, accreditation, food safety, occupational health and safety, tobacco regulations, or gun control. Some people see this as invasive and restricting their individual autonomy. And people feel like they're being coerced into something that they don't want to do. That's a lot of the argument against the Affordable Care Act is you're coercing me into purchasing something that I don't want to have to do. Okay? Responses to public health problems may be in the best economic interests of the individual or business. Again, look at what's happening with COVID-19. Individual businesses were told you have to close in order to protect public health. People pushed back on that, said, you can't tell me what to do. It's my right to remain open. The book gives the example of Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which is the second scenario at the beginning of the chapter. And this is where they bring up whether or not vaccination should be mandatory or whether people, because of their individual rights, should be able to say no. And so we have to consider, as the COVID-19 situation progresses and a vaccination is developed, should people be told they have to get it? And there's a yes or no to that and a lot of arguments. A lot of what we talk about in health promotion is whether or not businesses can be held legally responsible for health problems. The tobacco industry clearly was held responsible for a lot of the issues they caused from a health standpoint. But then we can shift that to say, hey, what about Coca-Cola? Can they be deemed responsible for the obesity crisis? And so a lot of this goes back and forth in terms of who we blame and how we enforce this. Okay. What does not help our situation is the way in which the Constitution is written. In the book, they talk about the fact that the Constitution is written in negative terms. There's a lot of prohibitions, things you cannot do in the Constitution to protect individual rights, but that doesn't grant a lot of rights. So it's written in a negative meaning, and that's not in terms of like a mindset. It's just in terms of what it takes away, but it does not grant a lot. Okay. So it doesn't grant a right to healthcare. It doesn't grant several things. And so law becomes a very limiting device. It separates powers. It provides checks and balances. It provides some procedural protections. But we have no legal right to healthcare based on the Constitution, and some of that comes back to the way in which this is written. Okay, so that covers Chapter 6. If you have any questions, go back, refer to the notes, your book, and then send any questions along to me.